Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for taking your time here today. You could have been doing anything, so we're really happy that you're here with us. Really excited to bring this particular presentation to you. First off, from everyone here in the Downtown UX group, really we hope that you and your family are doing well. I know it's a really tough time for everybody, and I hope everyone's feeling safe and is well and being good. Um, awesome. So a little housekeeping rules. It's a remote meeting. We would love to see you. We, at least on the organizer group, we thrive on human connection. So definitely if possible, please keep your camera on, but Zoom fatigue is a real thing. So definitely kind of play it as you will. We would love to see you if that's okay with you. If you have any questions along the way, definitely feel free to raise your hand, post it in the chat. I'd love to hear from you all along the conversation. So don't feel like you have to wait until the end. And lastly, if you have any questions or comments, definitely let us know. The organizing group will try to field all the questions so that Ryan can kind of continue. Who are the organizers? So there are 5 of us. So it's Matt, Leah, Wes, Jason, and myself. We're always looking for speakers. We're always looking for how to make this meetup better, more useful for you. So if you ever think of anything, or if you want to share or anything, just hit us up. We would love to talk to you and learn more about why you're here and how we can make this better for you. Awesome. So our mission, the Downtown Orlando UX Group, is here to create opportunities for anyone to learn and share, learn about UX and share their knowledge with other people in the field of user experience. Everyone on the team is UXer, and we really love when we can do this initially amongst ourselves, now with everybody. So really appreciate everyone joining here. Although we don't meet in person anymore when we used to, Tech Systems was one of our really awesome sponsors. They gave us beer and pizza, so we're sort of indebted to them for the rest of our lives. And hopefully, as soon as we can go back, they can bring back some beer and pizza. We're very grateful for Tech Systems for being with us for the 5 years or so that they have. So I want to show our appreciation here for them. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Ryan. But before that, let me kind of maybe share my story about Ryan a little bit. So I first got to know Ryan through Code Commit. So I was in graduate school, and I was working on a project, and I have no idea what I'm doing here. So I was trying to figure out if someone else built this project I can get help from. And then I look at the code, and I saw Ryan's name on it. So I LinkedIn stalked him, found him online. So he used to go to my college. And then I asked him for some help. And at that point, that's kind of when we first met. So at that point, Ryan was a senior engineer at Yahoo. Since then, he has moved on to Salesforce and is currently at Adapar. He also has a YouTube channel, a blog, and tons of awesome things that he builds and makes for developers and designers. So I'm really excited to hand the stage to Ryan to talk about UX Men, Days of Future Past. So maybe we can, as we hand the presentation over to Ryan, quickly give him a round of applause for taking the time to come join us today. So let me stop sharing. Ryan, you should be good to go.
All right. So thank you so much for the introduction. That was way better than I'd expected it to be. But yeah, let me share my screen, and that's I'll get started with that. I'm going to share. It's in present mode. All right. So well, as I was saying, my name is Ryan, and I have been working in the field of UX and front-end development for the past 10 years. And lately I've been working as a front-end engineer at Adapar. And I'm based in New York City. And it so happened that I came to New York just a month before COVID decided to come to New York. So it's been just a great experience living here. But fortunately, I got a chance to attend some of your meetups before, and it's been interesting to see how you guys have still been able to communicate with everyone and have these meetups so we can all learn from each other. So hopefully today I can present something to all of you that by drawing upon some of my experiences, and hopefully you'll take away some things from here today. So let's get started. This talk is titled UX Days of Future Past. And there's a reason for this. The reason is multifold. So I love the movie, of course, like many of us. And I hope I don't give away any spoilers. That's the intent. And the other reason was that as I was thinking about this talk, I felt like I'm looking at myself as I was growing in my career and making a lot of mistakes and learning from those mistakes, and not actually mistakes. Like I was doing things and learning by doing, right? So to me, it was a reflection of the things that I've been doing, and hopefully I can give some of those reflections to you. So this talk is about Sentinels. This entire story is about Sentinels. So what are Sentinels? Sentinels are creatures that were created out because of the result of short-sightedness. We made certain decisions and Sentinels were born. And it took them a certain period of time to grow into these powerful creatures that no matter what kind of powers you have, you might be a designer, a developer, a PM, a CTO, you alone cannot defeat them. Sentinels don't care about who you are. They take down individuals, teams, products, and companies. And these are the Sentinels that we will learn how to tackle in this talk. So let's start with the idea of user research. So what is user research? From my perspective, user research is our ability to get into our user's mind. We use this amazing superpower that we learn by watching YouTube videos, by attending meetups, by reading books, and we try to get into the mind of our users to understand what they want to do with our products. However, there are certain things or two important things that I want to bring to light that I feel are very important in this journey of conducting a user research. The first aspect of them is listening. Now, why is listening so difficult? I have always found it one of the most difficult things to do when conducting a user research. Now, this might seem weird to say. It is quite easy. You can just keep quiet and listen. But when we talk about listening, we are not just saying listen with your ears. You want to listen with your thoughts. You want to pay attention to what people are saying and what they mean by it. So the question is, why is it so difficult to listen? And as I thought about it, I realized that as product owners, we have a lot of context about what is to come, right? We sit down in meetings, we talk to our developers, we have an idea of the product the way it is now, we have an idea of what our PMs or everybody else in the company wants it to be like, right? So we have some context about, or not some, we have actually have a lot of context about what is to come as compared to a user that just comes to a user session and is looking at a prototype. And the second thing is we also have an agenda to build something because a certain amount of decisions have already been made. A delivery has to be done in Q1, in Q2, and Q3. So we have a roadmap. We just don't know the details of the roadmap, but we have a roadmap, right? So we want to build something, and not just that. When we are coming up with a design to share with our users, we want to validate or invalidate some of our assumptions. So we know a lot more than our users have. Users have at the time they come to attend a user session. So we have these things going on in our mind. And I believe these are the things that makes it difficult for us to listen. So the question is, what can we do, right? One of the things I like to do when conducting any session is try not to limit your users' imagination. Let them be visual. So let's say you're talking to your users and they go off on a tangent. They're talking about a product that you may or may not have heard or used. Maybe it's a competitor. Maybe it's something that is unrelated to your product, but they can draw parallels from that, from the experiences of using that, and they can tell you things that you don't know. So let users be visual about how they want to use your product, and at that time listen to what they're trying to say. And the second thing is, when your users make incorrect assumptions or state their preference, try to understand why. Usually when I've conducted studies and I've asked people to, let's say, click on parts of prototype. Now, most prototypes allow you the ability to create a hotspot. And when those hotspots blink, in spite of that, when I see people clicking somewhere else, it kind of, maybe it's just me, maybe it's most of you, but it is possible that you have a feeling that why is our user not clicking on the hotspot? It's even telling you to click on it, right? But that doesn't always happen. At that point, instead of getting frustrated as to why is our user not interacting with that, or why are they not looking at the areas that are blinking, it is important to stop and ask them and try to understand what assumptions you're trying to make about your interface, because they are making some assumptions based on the task you assign to them, and they're expecting something to be somewhere else in spite of things being right in front of their eyes and blinking. So that's one aspect. The second aspect is they might have preferences to interacting with the interface in a certain way, although you have created a path for it. So it's important to understand why they have those assumptions and why they have certain preferences. The second aspect after listening is levels of immersion. And by that, I mean, we are heavily immersed in our product. For us, our product takes up about 8 to 9 hours of our life per day. For some of us, it's even more than that. But for our users, it can vary by a very large factor. For example, if you're building a product that deals with social media, your users have extended periods of immersion, like Facebook, Instagram, and all those things. They spend a lot more time on their apps than any other app. The second one is tax filing, because it's tax season. This was the best example I could think of. You have a lot of immersion, but it's only for a few hours or maybe for a few days, and then for the rest of the year, you forget about it. The next one is, let's say you're building a product for food delivery. At this point, you have sporadic immersion. For example, your customer might use the app while they're at home to check the delivery status, or to place an order, or it might be the person who's trying to do the delivery. They might log into the app, they might check and say delivery has been completed and stuff like that. So it's short bursts of interaction. And the other one is, let's say a good example would be the audio player, where you have passive usage. The product is always on. It is being used, but for a brief moment, let's say while they're driving or while they're doing some other activity, while they're working out, they want to interact with it for a short moment, and it's very immersive at that point of time. So there are different levels of immersion that our users experience with our products as compared to what we experience with our products. So the question is, what can be done here, right? Now, the obvious answer to it is contextual inquiry, but this is easier said than done. I remember a time when I first joined my first job, and I was working with a bunch of devs, and they were saying that, okay, they were talking about CI, like CI is, we need to look at CI. And I thought they're talking about contextual inquiry. Little did I know they were talking about continuous integration. It was
your audio cut out, right? So I can't hear you.
Hello?
Yeah, I can hear you now.
Okay. Yeah, I think if I don't hear audio, this thing turns off. That's a funny thing. All right. The next one is, the next one is exploratory versus transactional interfaces. So when we talk about, this is something that how I like to categorize interfaces. So let's say you have an interface with a lot of information. Is that interface supposed to help the user explore parts of the system, or is it something that is part of a transaction? Is the user trying to work on a part from trying to get from point A to point B, and this particular interface is just one step in that process, right? So this will help you determine how much information or what levels of immersion you want to create on each interface. So this is an image of, I think, Pyro, and the other one is Iceman. And they're having a battle, right? And if you see, they have very different ways of, two very different superpowers, first of all, and very different ways of communicating, very different ways of expressing themselves. what I'm talking about is localization and internationalization. This is something that I have noticed that is often overlooked, or it is attended to at the end of the design or dev cycle. And it may not be immediately relevant or even relevant to every product, because let's say you're working on a startup, and your startup, it may take some time to scale to a level that you may have to deploy to another country. So at that point, maybe it is not necessary for you to work on localization for the next 1 to 2 years or 3 years maybe. But if you're already working in a team where your product is deployed with people who use it in different languages, then internationalization suddenly becomes an important thing to do, and not just for a developer, but even for a designer. The other important thing is UI elements can significantly shift and break when localized. And this is very difficult to notice in the early or even in the final iterations of the design. The things shift depending on the way a developer has coded those pieces of the interface. So one thing I often like to have, or I would recommend, or one thing that I've generally worked with designers when I've been working as a dev, I work with designers to have a small design iteration or get a bunch of questions where we can identify places in the application where long strings are displayed. So let's say you have a name or you have a long user message that shows up in a toast or a notification, right? So we often put a tiny message in our mockups showing that, oh, an error has happened. But sometimes the error message is 3 lines long, right? With an error code that nobody understands. In spite of that, those long messages need to have a way for, like, you have to offer a way for users to see the message and take an action based on it. And at that point, if the message gets cut off, or if the message just cannot be read in completion, or if it breaks the UI in a way that it looks pretty ugly, in today's time and age, people are just going to post it on social media, right? And that may or may not be a good thing, depending on what you're aiming for in terms of publicity. But it's always nice to have an iteration where you say, okay, I'm gonna put in UI strings that are 1.5 times to 2 times, or generally 1.5 times is a good rule to have. So just add some text that is 1.5 times the size and see what happens, because certain languages, like I think German especially, will have like really long words, and your simple buttons that look very nice in a nice tightly fit UI, it's just going to get cut off in many other interfaces. The other one is determine what text or layout changes are necessary to accommodate long strings. So let's say you have in your initial mockup, you had a bunch of buttons that were laid out side by side, right? And you handed it off to a developer, and the developer decided to just code it the way it looked like. But when the labels of those buttons were much larger than you had anticipated, it can so happen that those buttons, let's say 3 of them are on the same line, and the next to go to the next line. So at that point, you may not even know this until someone in a different language opens your application and sees it that way, right? And they may or may not even tell you about it. Now, in some cases, that might be the kind of UI which is okay, in the sense like it is desirable, it is not bad, but maybe it is something you don't want to have in your interface ever. Maybe if you had thought about it, you would have stacked them vertically, or you would have had them center aligned on a different way. So by having a design iteration where you replace short strings with long strings, you can make sure that layout changes happen based on what you expect it to look like. So some of the common ways that developers and designers solve these issues after going through discussions and having cycles of iterating on the design is we often add ellipses to the long strings once we understand that it's not necessary for the user to see the entire text. So in that cases, you can add an ellipsis to some places, and then you can support it with tooltips. The other thing is you can add acronyms or initials as well. So the common example is if you have a Gmail account, your name, if you don't have a profile picture, they will use the initials of your name. So that's another small thing that people do. The other thing that is somewhat more difficult to achieve is rephrasing messages that style a mixture of data and text. And the example is, let's say you have an original message which says you need 20 more points to reach the next level. Okay. So in this particular text, notice that 20 more points is colored with green, right? Now, when you hand it off to somebody who's going to do some localization to this, they might switch the order of words. So the words more and points may not 20 or the entire phrase 20 more points may not come together. It is possible. Now, this is just an example where where they are all colored in the same color, but it is possible that you might give it a different color at that point as well, right? And then once it is translated, the word points and more might be far away from each other, or there might be another word in between them. So this is conversational. However, conversational is tricky when you add formatting to it. So one of the things that I've often had to resort to is to make it less conversational, but equally informative. So I would say something like points to reach the next level is 20. So in this case, I can achieve some kind of styling to draw the user's attention, but I can still convey the same information. And this is something that you would often do on a case-by-case basis. But the easiest rule of thumb that I try to take is style the data differently from the message. So in this case, 20 is styled separately from the actual message. All right. So the next thing I want to talk about is all these characters, right? These are all the characters in the movie. And if for those of you who have watched the movie, imagine what the movie would have felt like if the director decided to give 20, 25 minutes to each of these characters. It would certainly go beyond 10 to 15 hours. And at that point, nobody would have sat down and watched the movie. So what am I hinting at? Well, the concept is less is more. You focus on a few important characters and their storyline, and that's how you build a movie that is watchable in the amount of time that your audience can tolerate. But the question that arises is, what should I remove, right? Because you wanna have all these elements. They're all important to the storyline, but how do you decide how to prioritize something? This is a picture of Steve Jobs, and we all know how he was in terms of how he chose to dress when giving presentations. And the important thing about how he did this was he would design, he would he would try to reduce the number of decisions he was making. And think about it, like as the CEO of one of the biggest companies in the world, and giving such a presentation, he would have so many things going on in his mind. He did not want to spend time thinking about something that is not as important. So my takeaway from that is, like, what is the question, or what question is the user trying to ask themselves in the back of their mind when they are on a certain interface, right? So this also goes back to the point of like creating an exploratory versus a transaction interface. On this particular user interface, what is the user thinking? So you have to through user research, you find out what they're thinking, and then all right, I should be back. Yeah. Through user research, you find out what they're thinking, and while designing, you try to prioritize what were the most important thoughts and what were the most important questions that you want this particular interface to answer. And the other simple thing you can do is you can progressively reveal information. For example, let's say you have a table with a bunch of records, and usually just a summary of the table can give users enough information to take an action. At that point, you can have a drill down view where if you click on a certain row, a model appears or something appears below the row. And that way, if they want to drill down, they can learn more about it, right? So this is primary versus secondary information, where you classify all the data on your UI. Although you can show all of it at the same time, you choose to show only a certain part of it that gives you the most important bits to make a decision. So how does less is more translate to developer effort? right? The first thing is it leads to fewer API calls. And what that means is when you have to show a lot of information on the user interface, we have to run a lot of queries to generate the data to be shown on the UI. And when you have a lot of queries running, you end up with a lot more server load, which means if your app has to scale to millions of clients, you will have to pay more for server resources, right? And whereas if on the interface your users are only using a certain slice of information and that is more than enough for them to do 80% of their work, you're using server resources for something that is never being used by the user. The second thing is it leads to fewer network requests because based on how you have designed your interface, a front-end developer might choose to program it in a way that multiple network calls are made. And if you're making multiple network calls, you're consuming more bandwidth and stuff like that. So the fewer network requests you make, the faster you can show information to your user, the faster they can interact with it. The other thing is smaller page size in terms of the number of bytes downloaded. So the less you download, uh, the less you're consuming your user's bandwidth, and this can impact people who don't have a high-end phone or who are not using an unlimited plan and stuff like that. So in that case, if they are on a plan where they're constantly worried about running out of their data usage limits, or if they're on a phone that does not process a lot of data at the same time very well, they might choose not to use your app very often. The other thing is render time and time to interactive. So when you load a lot of data on your interface, the JavaScript it has to run has to process that data. It has to transform all that blob of text into something that can be used and interacted with on the UI. And it takes time for your application. If you're working on your laptop, it's going to be much faster. But if all of the data is still being loaded on your phone is not as powerful as your laptop. And it is going to take time and it's going to slow down the speed of or let me put it this way, it's going to take the user more time to interact with the application because the application is still trying to build the UI for the user to interact with it. The other thing is placeholders. Now, when you have a lot of data on the UI, what tends to happen is if you're making multiple network calls to show the UI, you can either say that I'm going to show one spinner, and that spinner is going to show up until all of my data is loaded, right? And you have like 5 network calls going out versus saying, I'm going to have, let's say you have 6 different modules on your page. You can have 6 different spinners now, right? And that may not be a desirable experience to have, depending on how you deal with it, right? You can, if you have placeholders like the way Facebook does it, in that case, it is somewhat more bearable, but having 6 to 7 spinners because there are 6 network calls going on may not be the best user experience. The other thing is like when you have less, it's a lot easier to maintain. It's a lot easier to test code, and it's also a lot easier to deliver incrementally because you can plan your sprints in a lot more efficient manner. You know what can be delivered in a certain sprint when only a part of it. Let's say you have a page that has 5 or 6 different pieces, and they all can be delivered, one after the other, versus saying I need all of this to be delivered. Only then I can, share it with my clients or share it with the customer. So if you follow the less is more principle, you can also deliver incrementally to your end users. The other thing is I want to talk about an unexpected ally, which I had never thought while I was studying UX or throughout the early years of my, but mostly when I was studying, right? Because when I started working, this became so evident that I was surprised. I had, let me talk about in terms of how I wanted to tell the story. So our allies may not look like us. Our allies may not have the same superpowers that we have. Nevertheless, they are part of the system and they know things that we may not. And I'm talking about a QA. Now, the interesting thing is developers and QAs usually work somewhat closely. A lot of times, I often find myself doing QA work on my own a lot of times, or I've also been in situations where I would have a manual tester sitting right beside me, or a few cubicles ahead of me, and we would often work very closely because we build the interface, and we have to add attributes for testing. We have to build it in a way that QA can actually test it out, right? So there's a very close relationship between QAs and developers. However, it is very rare for designers to ever consult and work with QA. And I think this is a big problem, because when you work with QA very closely, and they will often come up and tell you, and they will show you things that you don't even know anything about. For example, a lot of times when I would work with a QA, they would come and show me something about the app that works in a different way in some part, and it works differently in the new design. And they would tell me that this seems very confusing. Like, why are we doing it like this here and like this over there? Don't you think people will be confused? Right? And I've often seen that designers would never be involved. Designers would never involve QA in any conversations related to design. They would never be part of it. They would always receive the tail end of the whole process. But I personally feel that QAs that perform especially manual testing, they are a very rich source of information about all kind of optimizations and repetitive workflows, because they have to do it so many times. They know they know all the repetitive workflows that our users may not like. And if we can gather this information from them, we can actually make our product better. And the other thing is, they are aware of all the edge cases. Like, uh, if you have a PM, if you have a new designer on the team, right, and they have been tasked with a new interface, designing a new interface, and they build it out given the requirements that were assigned to them. They may not know all the other scenarios in which things may go wrong, but a QA does, and they can help feed this process. In the absence of easy access to users in the early phases of design and iterations, a QA can be a very rich source of information of what grounds you should cover, or what your design should consider. Now, I want us to do a very tiny thought experiment, actually. It's going to be very simple. I heard about this in a book, and I think it was no, it was not Zig Ziglar. It was some other book. But I want us all to take a moment and just imagine a lemon. Imagine a nice yellow lemon. Imagine it is sliced, and imagine that you're biting out of it. Imagine the juice of the lemon flowing into your mouth. Imagine the taste. Imagine how you feel. Imagine the sourness. Imagine everything about that experience of biting into a lemon. The important thing that I wanted to highlight here is that
Lost you there a little bit.
yep, yeah, it's like a 20-minute timer after, which is just or 10-minute timer. Yeah, yeah. So the thing I wanted to highlight is that even though you didn't have a lemon, if some of you have tried did actually go through this tiny thought experiment, you would have felt the sourness of a lemon. There was no lemon in your mouth in reality, right? But you would have felt it. You would have had a physical reaction to what it feels like to bite a lemon. And that's why I like to always imagine interactions. So our mind has the best graphics card and is the fastest developer. So when you're designing things, you often start with a static image, right? You build it, you have a vision of what everything would look like, but you start with a static image. And what happens is that over the course of the cycle of development and working with designers or with other developers, you would begin to talk about the interactions, about how it feels to touch, how it feels to scroll. Now, it takes time for people to actually encode all of this into using all the tools that we have today. But we can always close our mind, close our eyes, and think about how anyone would interact with a product. And you don't have to wait for a developer to do that for you. And this is amazing. I really find this amazing that that our mind can take text and sounds and just turn them into three-dimensional objects that we can feel and experience through more than one sense. Like you would get goosebumps just by listening to a song. I mean, there are so many physical reactions that can come just by reading text or listening to a sound. And our mind can do that. And it's something that still amazes me. And the important thing is that through these things I want to bring up is that the reality does not already exist, and the fact that we imagine it into existence. So if you can imagine a certain interaction in your mind, and if it feels right, you can then imagine it into existence. So here's one of my favorite characters in this movie, and she's Blink. I think she's Blink. And she has this interesting superpower of creating portals, which means she can escape from anything that is coming to attack her, or she can send it away to, she can send her opponents to a different area. In spite of that, she's vulnerable to an attack. She's vulnerable to attacks. And this always goes to say that no matter what happens, there are always going to be edge cases. So anything that can go wrong will go wrong. And the interesting thing is developers always have to deal with this. Like even when you give a developer a design, what happens is you create a nice design that for a particular or very optimistic use case. And that's usually the starting point. But there are a million ways in which things can go wrong. And developers often have to write try-catch blocks and write test cases to cover everything that can go wrong. So one of the things that I like to think of when implementing a design after I've gone through the optimistic case is have a what if design iteration. In the sense like what if the user clicks something else, right? You can figure out try to figure out all the example edge cases of what can go wrong if the user interacts with the interface in a way that you have not intended for them to. So common edge cases are like you have a network error and you have an invalid or incomplete input. A user does not complete the input and tries to submit it before that. Do you want to prevent them from doing that, or do you want to correct them after the fact, right? So those are two different ways of solving this problem. Sometimes users press the back button, and sometimes in some designs I've seen people put a button that literally does the job of going back, right? So you may or may not want to do that, depending on what kind of experience you want to give to your users. The other thing which happens quite often is submitting something more than once consecutively, and this goes. So when you're thinking about this, you always have to say, do I disable the button? And if you have a disabled button, you have to have a disabled state of the button to prevent users from doing that. You have to have some feedback. So this is something that you would actually encode as part of your design system. So a button has to have a state like this, and this is when it gets activated. Now that I've talked about so many things, right, it sometimes feels overwhelming in terms of building user interfaces in today's day and age. 50 years ago, the people who used computers were a very small group. And if you were to make something that was really not enjoyable, really not fun, or which was not optimal, you would only affect a very small subsection of society. But that is not the case today. Today, everything that you do impacts more people than you can imagine. And people from all kinds of demographics use all kinds of products. So it may sometimes feel very overwhelming to deal with all the all the things that you have to consider while building an interface. But at the same time, you also have to face a lot of inner conflicts in terms of priorities and choices that you have to make. So one of the things I like to think of is when such a situation arises that you have to prioritize something or make a choice of delivering something that may or may not be optimal, you probably want to look back at the person in the future and take guidance from that person as to what you would do had you, if you had the chance to do it again. What would that person in the future tell you to do? And there's one of my favorite quotes from Zig Ziglar is like, if there is hope in the future, there's power in the present. So it's always nice to look at it, to sometimes look at yourself in the future and ask yourself, what would I tell myself if I was already in the future? And we always think that the future is written, right? The world is the way it is today, and we have to work around it. We have to make certain decisions, and we are limited by things that have been built today. But the reality is that the future does not truly exist, except what did I just except for the choices that we make today. And by that I mean everything that we have been building upon so far, it has been built by other people, right? There's someone who sat and imagined every tool, every product that we use today. And today, we are that person who's sitting and who's imagining, who's designing all these things. And we are making those decisions. And collectively, we are shaping the future. So the future doesn't truly exist. We are making it through the choices that we are making today. So you can go ahead and make things to make future better than what it is today. Now that I've shared a few of my battle scars with you, I hope that in the next couple of minutes and over happy hour, we can have a few good discussions, and I'll be open to answering questions as well. Thank you so much.
Awesome. Thank you, Ryan. You could probably do a quick round of applause to Ryan before we can jump into some questions. That sounds wonderful. Thanks so much. Woo!
That was great, Ryan. Thanks so much.
I'm going to kick it off with a question that has sort of been burning in my mind. So Ryan, you're currently a product engineer, and I know we have a lot of UX designers here, and I know you've been a UX designer before. Do you feel like you put on like different hats as you kind of transition these roles, or do you feel like the transition is just another skill set away from sort of what you're doing right now?
I think it's a very I have worn multiple hats at different times, and a lot of times I felt that I've had to fill in the gaps, right? Sometimes your team does not have a dedicated design resource, right? And a lot of times I would jump in, I would say, you know what, I will take care of some part of this until we have a dedicated designer to work on it. Or at sometimes you'd work on a project where it's very dev heavy, and people are not prioritizing things in terms of design. So in such projects, I would be the voice of design and say, okay, we should think about these things. We should think about how it integrates with the entire product, right? And at times, I would work with designers to help them formulate questions for the user research based on discussions that I've been having with PMs and based on other competitor analysis that I've done. So it's interesting because when you're involved with the design of anything, it gives you a reason to do what you're doing, right? Instead of just saying, oh, I've been handed over this mock-up and I need to build this, versus saying, I know exactly how enjoyable or how our users are really looking forward to building this. It motivates you to build it, and you can convey that motivation, that enthusiasm to your teammates, right? That way everybody has a reason to build something together. And I think that's the fun part of being able to do different things or transition between roles whenever you get a chance to.
Awesome, thank you. That's really insightful. Maybe we can do one more question if anyone has any at the top of their head. And then we can transition over to our closing statement and then happy hour. So we can get together and see if there's any other questions. Anyone has any question they'd like to post at this point? Awesome, go for it, Chris.
Ryan, thank you for the presentation. I have a question where how have you seen success with UX designers and developers building a closer relationship, and even maybe project managers or POs? Like, what has worked the best in your experience, and maybe even if there's something that you've seen that doesn't work so great, like things to avoid, that would be cool.
Yeah, I think what works the best is when the PMs themselves take the initiative to involve both the designers and developers in the early phase of the design. Because I'm saying so because I've seen the opposite happen quite a lot, where PMs would generally work closer with the designers and they would make all these decisions and then hand it off and say, or let's say a month down the line, show something to developers that this is what we're planning to do and this is going to be great. And then what happens is a negative reaction, because people are taken aback. They're surprised with all these changes that are coming up, but they don't understand why, right? If you don't have an understanding of the intention of the product to build this, then you're less inclined to support it, and you're more inclined to find faults in it, right? Whereas if you involve people early on, you get them in a room and say, okay, here are the things we are trying to think about. We have a designer here, and they'll be working with us on this. And you in the early stages itself, developers can bring up certain concerns. They can bring up things that they wish the new solution can solve, right? So then they feel they have a voice in it, and then they are a lot more incentivized to support the cause of the team.
Awesome. Just kind of a slight follow-up on that, because I think that's a really awesome approach, is just having everyone involved from the beginning. And it shouldn't be a surprise whenever you are presenting at the end of a sprint, right?
Yeah.
But what about the developer or even the UXer or PO or PM that has resistance to that, where, oh, I don't need to be a part of that, I've got too much coding to do, or you know what, I really need to spend a lot of time on the whiteboard by myself? Like, how do you get the person to cross that chasm, just by dragging them along on a small one? Or do you have other things that you've seen that have worked? Or maybe you've never met anyone like that, I don't know.
There are nowadays, I would say there are fewer people like that, because maybe early on there were more people, but in the early stages there is not a lot of design going on, right? In the early stages, you're answering questions within the team itself. You're trying to answer questions, and at that point, everyone feels like they can say something, because they have not seen anything, because there is nothing to see, right? So people with opinions, they usually speak out at that time, and they feel heard. But I understand at later stages, a lot of people, there are some people who will obviously not want to get involved with design, but because it's the later stage, right? They don't want to play with Sketch or Figma and stuff. That's not what they like to do. But you want to involve them early on. So when you involve them early on, I've not seen any kind of resistance. People are willing to talk about stuff.
Awesome, great. Well, thank you.